All right, welcome back, class, to room 102. Today we're going to be looking at the 7th to the 9th centuries of church history, namely looking at the rise of Islam and the
Get
reign
out!
of Charlemagne.
This is
So
my
I'm
class.
really excited to be going over. Hey class, welcome back. As my friend said, we are going to be talking about the rise of Islam and the reign of Charlemagne. But before we do that, let's look at our Not So Dark Ages fun fact of the day. Today's Not So Dark Ages fun fact is that by the time the so-called Dark Ages came about, the majority of Europe already knew that the world was spherical, and we had already calculated its circumference.
Wow. 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 Wow.
So let's dive into the rise of Islam and the reign of Charlemagne. So I'm going to gloss over a little bit about the rise of Islam because this is more of a ecclesiology focused class. But to give you just a little background, Islam was started by Muhammad, who was born in 570 AD, born in Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, in a world where the majority of the Arabs worshiped multiple deities. But around year 40 of his life, he started to hear the voice of God telling him to worship the one God, or in Arabic, Allah. And this God, he believed, was the God of Abraham, and he traced his lineage back to Abraham's son, Ishmael. And so Muhammad begins to spread this new religion, and primarily Islam begins to spread through political and military victories, taking over the entire Arabian Peninsula. And one interesting thing about Islam is that it has a heavy emphasis on the ummah, or the community. That Muslim life is not seen as an individual relationship, but rather it's heavily societal, and one of the goals is to spread this society abroad. And so Islam officially starts in 622 AD, and within 20 years, Islam has taken over a large chunk of the Arabian Peninsula and starts conquering notable Christian cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, all within the first 20 years of Islam. Later, it takes over Carthage in North Africa and starts invading both the Eastern and the Western Empire. The height of the Eastern invasion is the Siege of Constantinople, which happens in the 670s, and in the 730s and 40s, Muslim invaders make it all the way to northern France in the Battle of Tours. As you can see, this just explodes like wildfire. But notice Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria have all been taken over by Muslims. Those are 3 of our 5 patriarchal cities. And so with the fall of those cities, the only 2 cities who remain intact in terms of your patriarchs are Rome and Constantinople. So we're going to see, because of this expansion of Islam, that Rome and Constantinople are really going to be your only major players going forward with Christianity. Now I want to look at what it was like to be a Christian under Muslim rule in the city of Jerusalem. And I want to look at this just through this really famous building called the Dome of the Rock. Now, initially, Muslims did not force Christians to convert to Islam. However, they were treated as second-class citizens and forced to pay a tax for not being Muslim. And it wasn't just Christians who were taxed like this. Anyone who was not Muslim was forced to pay an additional tax. But upon conquering Jerusalem, the leader of the Muslim army goes around to find a site to build a worship site, a mosque. The land that they settle on is the site of the Jewish temple. And so upon where for centuries and centuries the Jewish temple had stood, Muslims begin to build the Dome of the Rock, this major worship site. It is the largest and most ornate building in all of Jerusalem, passing even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where the tomb and the site of the crucifixion are. But one thing I want to point out is that the Dome of the Rock has a number of different verses written in Arabic from the Quran on the interior walls. And one is very striking, which says, "O you people of the book, overstep not bounds in your religion, and of God speak only truth. The Messiah Jesus, son of Mary, is only an apostle of God, and his word which he conveyed into Mary in a spirit or a soul proceeding from him. Believe therefore in God and his apostles, and say not three, it will be better for you. God is only one God." As you can see, there's some very explicit anti-Christian, anti-Trinitarian language on the Dome of the Rock, which is built on the site of the Jewish temple. And so the Dome of the Rock in its location, as well as a lot of its writing, kind of tell you what the purpose of taking over Jerusalem is going to be. Jerusalem is the third most important city for Islam, and their goal is to make it into a Muslim city. What had been for almost 500, 600 years been a Christian city, and before that for 1,000 years been a Jewish city. By the year 750 AD, over half of the Christian world has been conquered by Islam. The Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire in the East, is crumbling, and what remains of the Western Empire is trying to piece itself back together, but there's a great culture struggle that is happening. In all these lands where Christians are under Muslim rule, they are treated as second-class citizens, forced to pay another tax, and the culture struggle really takes place in actually language. That Arabic is starting to replace Greek and Latin in all of these areas. There's been studies done in which scientists wanted to know what let people know they were part of a group and what let them know they were not part of a group. Essentially, what makes that us and them idea come about? And so there are a number of different theories. Is it race? Is it ethnicity? Is it religion? Is it preferences? Is it like what art you like what you like to do? And they found of all the different things that could separate us, the number one thing that tells you whether you're a part of a community or not part of the community is actually language. Really that question of, do they sound like me and do they say the same things as me?
Have you or someone you love ever been to certain parts of the Midwest and wondered, "Hey there guy, can you borrow me a battery? What in the hell is this guy saying?"
Notice in your friend groups you all sound the same, and when someone who's not part of your friend group comes in, they say different things, they have different jokes, and they may even have slightly different accents. And as you start to become a community, those all merge together. And so this culture struggle of changing languages and accents really is starting to change how Christians in these areas think about themselves. And some major effects of the rise of Islam on Christianity are this. First, within 150 years of the start of Islam, over half of the land that was previously owned and lived in by Christians is now conquered by Muslims. The Eastern Roman Empire is crumbling and being conquered by Muslims. Constantinople itself is under siege for 4 years. And in the Western world, a bunch of these Western kingdoms that are much smaller are still busy infighting, and Muslims are starting to conquer them and have taken over most of Spain. Meanwhile, the Pope is seeing this happening on both sides and has an enemy knocking on his own door called the Lombards. And we'll look back at them. But before we talk about the Lombards, I want to look at the rise of the Carolingians and the Holy Roman Empire, which happens just a little bit after the rise of Islam. So to set the scene, we are at the Battle of Tours in northern France, and this is the height of the Muslim invasion in the Western Empire. At this battle, the Muslim army is defeated by Charles Martel, also known as Charles the Hammer.
Stop! Hammer time!
Now, Charles the Hammer is important for a couple of reasons. One, he does push back the Muslim invaders, and he also is the beginning of what's known as the Carolingian line and is the father of Charlemagne. So, what happens after Charles the Hammer
Stop! Hammer time!
defeats the Muslim invaders is we start to get into some of the political drama of the two major kingdoms of this time in the West. The first is the Franks in modern-day France, and the second is the kingdom of the Lombards in northern Italy. So some background on this is the kingdom of the Franks was ruled by the Merovingians, who were the official kings. They had the lineage. But by this point, the Merovingians really only had that title of being the king and their line left. The people, the power, the influence, the respect, all of that belonged to their advisor, or what we could call maybe prime minister, Charles the Hammer.
Hammer time!
And so after this battle, he really gains the respect, and his son, Pippin, sends an embassy to Rome. And he requests the Pope to declare that the Carolingians are the true king and not the Merovingians. And the Pope accepts this. And the reason why he accepts the Carolingians line is because of the Lombards. Because Pippin promises to deal with the Lombards if he is given the kingdom of the Franks. So who are the Lombards? Well, they are traditionally Arian Christians in northern France who have been knocking on the doorstep of Rome for quite some time and at some points have successfully invaded it. And the whole purpose of this is they are attempting to make the Pope into a political puppet and trying to get the Pope to do what they want. Kind of like how in the East, the Roman emperor is making the Patriarch of Constantinople into his or her puppet. And so for a while, the Lombards actually kept the Pope under house arrest, and he is tired of this constant threat of political pressure from the north. And so he makes this deal with the Carolingians, and Pippin, the king, defeats the Lombards, and he frees Rome, and he creates what are known as the Papal States. Now, the Papal States stay their own country for over 1,000 years, and this was land he donated to the Pope. And so why did he create the Papal States, and why did he give this land and power to the Pope? Well, the real purpose was to decrease all of the political influence on the Pope. Because before this point, the Pope had no land, but had become such a major power that all the different kingdoms wanted to control the papacy. They had no land of their own, and so Pippin and the Carolingians give them the Papal States as a sort of buffer state to prevent other political rivals from trying to abuse the Pope, kind of like what is happening over in Constantinople. Now, this was a good idea because it did prevent a bunch of different kingdoms from gaining control of the Pope, but as you can see, the Pope now has land power and an army, and this could potentially be abused in the long term. And in fact, this will be abused in the long term.
Break it down!
But at the time, it made sense because of all the different kingdoms that are trying to take over the Pope and use him as a political puppet. Now, the Papal States will be actually very helpful in the coming century when the Muslims begin to invade Italy and have multiple sieges of Rome. Now, King Pippin dies and leaves two sons in charge, and I'm not going to go too in depth in this. All you need to know is one of the sons dies young at age 20, and the other remaining one is Charlemagne. And so he takes over all of this land that is modern-day France, modern-day Germany, and parts of modern-day Italy. And in the year 800 AD, the Pope crowns Charlemagne as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Here you have a sort of unification of modern-day Europe. But this is really important because its name is a huge slap to the face to the Eastern Empire. When they call themselves the Holy Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire is going to be looking at them and say, wait a minute, we're the Roman Empire. We've been the Roman Empire.
You're both Squidward?
I'm Squidward. He's Squidward. We're both Squidward.
Because remember, Rome fell, the Western Empire fell, but the Eastern Empire never fell at all. And so when they take the name the Holy Roman Empire, there's this sort of like ignoring of the Roman Empire that already exists in the East. And when he calls himself the Emperor, he's ignoring the Emperor in the East. Now this is going to lead to the further separation of the Eastern and the Western Church that eventually will lead to a schism that we're going to talk about in next class. And what's really important to note is at that time, the head of the Eastern Empire was actually an empress. So there was a bunch of people wondering, will the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne and the empress in the Eastern Empire marry and finally unite the two empires again? But unfortunately, this doesn't happen for a number of reasons that we're not going to go into. But what's important about this is you have a unification of Europe and an encouragement of the growth of Christianity. Because at this point, Europe was still plenty pagan. And so Charlemagne really starts to Christianize Europe. And so with the crowning of Charlemagne, you have what is known as the Carolingian Renaissance, which was a massive growth in scholarship and education. And most of the ancient texts and learning that we have today is preserved by monks during this time period. And all of this art and learning and education was primarily paid for by the Pope and Charlemagne. When people call the era before this the Dark Ages, they say that the crowning of Charlemagne is the end of the Dark Ages because after this you have this huge growth of art. And so right here we have the Palatine Chapel, which was where Charlemagne put his throne in Aachen. And if you look at this building, like, this is ornate, this is beautiful. This is not something that someone in a dark age could create. This is a sophisticated society. But I want you to look at his throne. Right? His throne has no gold in it. It's very simple and it's just made out of stone. And what's fascinating is this throne is made out of stones from the steps of Pilate's palace in Jerusalem. That Charlemagne was so dedicated to Christianity that he said, I do not want my throne to be on ornate silver and gold. I want it to be on the very steps that Jesus stood on when he was being sentenced to death. And so Charlemagne was a devout Christian. There's a story of his advisor telling him not to tax the Saxons, which are in modern-day Denmark or so, because they were not Christian. And he thought if we tax them, there'd be no way they'd become Christian. So Charlemagne says, all right, we're not going to tax them. Right? Because he cared more about gaining souls for God rather than just gaining earthly wealth. But as you can see, some beautiful architecture comes out of this time frame. And I'm just going to show you some pictures from monasteries where you start to get some really unique styles forming. You get beautiful art with engraved and illuminated manuscripts and these stone carvings. And you get things like the Book of Kells, which is an illuminated manuscript of all 4 of the Gospels in the Book of Acts, in which each page has these ornate and decorative designs. And so kind of wrapping up this video, the world going forward is going to be one of a lot of tension. You have tension within the Christian world of the Western and the Eastern empires not really getting along right now, as well as tension from the outside world of Muslim invaders going up Spain, going up Italy, and going from the east, taking over traditionally Christian land, while at the same time within the empires having these renaissances and places of great learning, as well as a pope that now has political land. So hopefully you see all this, that we're starting to get to the modern Europe, and if any of you take an AP Euro, you'll start to see why some of the things happen where you're just thrown into the beginning of AP Euro. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's video. This was definitely a lot. But again, I think this is a really important one because it's a time period in the world where we don't hear a lot about. And so a lot of us just kind of have this blank hole in the history. And it's good to know, how did Europe and the world get to where it is? So with that, I'm going to sign off. Say bye to my friend. I'm definitely putting that in there. Yeah. All right, stay healthy and stay holy, everyone.